The Monk and the Hungry Dog. In a small temple at the foot of a mountain, an elderly monk lived in complete harmony with nature. Each day, at dawn, he swept the fallen leaves, served tea to visitors, and meditated under an old cherry tree. One morning, while the monk was carrying out his routine, a skinny, dirty dog appeared at the entrance of the temple. Its eyes reflected hunger and exhaustion. Without hesitation, the monk took some rice from his bowl and placed it on the ground. The dog approached cautiously, sniffed the rice, and after a few seconds of doubt, began to eat. Then it looked at the monk and left silently. The next day, the dog returned. The monk smiled and placed more rice. The days passed, and the dog always returned at the same time, ate in silence, and left. One afternoon, a visitor to the temple saw the scene and asked, "Master, why do you feed that stray dog? It only comes for the food. It shows no gratitude or affection." The monk responded calmly, "Does the sun ask for gratitude for giving its light?" The visitor fell silent, reflecting on those words. The days continued, and the dog kept visiting the temple. But one day, when the monk placed the rice on the ground, the dog did not eat it immediately. Instead, it stared at the monk with deep eyes, as if it wanted to say something. The elderly monk smiled tenderly and sat in the lotus position in front of the animal. "Today, you are not hungry," he said softly. "So what are you seeking?" The dog wagged its tail slowly, then, with a trembling step, approached further. For the first time, it placed its head on the monk's lap and closed its eyes. The visitor who had questioned the master days before was watching the scene from afar. Intrigued, he approached and asked, "Master, has the dog learned gratitude?" The monk stroked the animal's head and replied, "The dog has not changed. You have simply begun to see with different eyes." The visitor frowned, trying to understand the meaning of those words. That night, while the monk meditated under the moonlight, the dog remained silently by his side. Its breathing was slow and calm, as if it had finally found a home. At dawn, the monk woke to the sound of the wind through the trees. He looked to his side and saw that the dog was no longer there. The visitor, curious, approached the master. "Master, the dog has gone. Do you not feel sadness?" The elderly monk smiled serenely. "Nothing in this world belongs to us, not even the moments shared. Everything is like the river. It flows without stopping." The visitor lowered his gaze, feeling a slight weight in his chest. "But what if it never comes back?" The monk took his broom and began sweeping the temple floor. "Then I will wish it a good journey," he said with a smile. "Love is not a chain, but a wind that blows freely." The visitor remained silent. For the first time, he felt there was something beyond the monk's words. Days passed, and the dog did not return. The visitor noticed that the monk continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He swept the floor, served tea, meditated under the cherry tree. One morning, unable to contain his unease, the visitor asked him, "Master, do you truly not miss the dog?" The elderly monk, without ceasing to sweep, responded calmly, "The wind blows today from the north, yesterday from the south. Do I miss it when it changes direction?" The visitor sighed, feeling a strange sadness. "But if the dog was happy here, why did it leave?" The monk leaned the broom against the wall and gazed at the horizon. "Because its path did not end at this temple. If I had kept it here, would that have been love or selfishness?" The visitor felt a lump in his throat. He looked at the bowl of rice the monk continued placing each day at the entrance of the temple, even though the dog was no longer there. "Why do you keep putting out rice if it does not return?" The elderly monk smiled tenderly. "Because the world is still hungry, even if my eyes do not see it." The visitor was left speechless. Days turned into weeks, and the rice bowl remained there, untouched at dawn and empty by sunset. No one saw who took it, but the monk never stopped placing it. The visitor, increasingly intrigued, decided to stay awake one night to uncover the truth. He hid in the shadows of the temple and waited in silence. At midnight, when the moon was high, a thin figure emerged from the darkness. It was not the dog, but a ragged old man, his gaze weary, and his bones marked by hunger. The man took the rice with trembling hands and ate it in silence. Then, with a deep bow to the temple, he disappeared into the night. The visitor, moved, approached the monk at dawn. "Master, all this time I thought you were placing the rice only for the dog." The monk offered him a cup of tea and smiled. "When you give, you should not ask who will receive. The water from the well does not choose who to quench." The visitor lowered his gaze, feeling ashamed of his limited thinking. "I was blind. I thought it was just an act of kindness toward an animal, but it was something much greater." The monk nodded gently. "True love does not cling to a form, it simply flows." The visitor closed his eyes, and for the first time, he felt that a deep truth was blossoming within him. The next day, before the sun fully appeared, the visitor took a handful of rice and placed it in the bowl at the entrance of the temple. The monk watched him silently, a faint smile on his face. "Today you did not ask why you are doing it," said the elderly monk. The visitor stared at the bowl, feeling warmth in his chest. "I don't need a reason," he replied. "I just know it is the right thing to do." The monk nodded. When the water flows without obstacles, it becomes a river. When the heart gives without expecting, it becomes compassion. That night, the visitor no longer felt the need to hide and watch who took the rice. It no longer mattered. Something had changed in his heart. The next morning, when he went out to the courtyard, he found the dog waiting at the entrance of the temple. But this time it was not alone. Beside it, another younger dog accompanied it, with the same hunger in its eyes. The visitor looked at the monk in astonishment, but the elderly monk only smiled and resumed sweeping, as if he had known it all along. The visitor looked at the two dogs in silence. The younger one trembled from hunger, just as the other had when it first arrived. Without thinking, he took another bowl and filled it with rice. He placed both bowls at the entrance and took a step back. The monk observed the scene with serenity. "Today you have given without fear," he said softly. The visitor nodded, feeling something new within him. A lightness, as if an invisible weight had disappeared. The dogs ate in silence, without hurry. When they finished, the older one lifted its gaze and fixed its eyes on the visitor. Then, with the same calm as always, it turned around and disappeared into the trees. The younger one followed, but before leaving, it paused for a moment and looked at the visitor, as if it wanted to remind him. The visitor felt a lump in his throat. "Why are they leaving, master?" he asked in a whisper. The monk leaned on his broom and replied, "Because they have received what they needed. And so have you." The visitor closed his eyes, letting the wind caress his face. For the first time, he understood. The next day, the visitor woke up before dawn. He walked to the entrance of the temple and, without thinking too much, filled a bowl with rice. He didn't know if anyone would come to take it, but that no longer mattered. The monk watched him silently as the visitor carefully placed the bowl, as if it were a sacred gesture. "Today you expect nothing in return," said the elderly monk. The visitor smiled softly. "Today, I simply let the river flow." The monk closed his eyes with satisfaction. The wind blew through the trees, carrying with it the fallen leaves, unanswered questions, and silent attachments. And in the midst of that perfect moment, the visitor understood that he had always been free.